I'm Mara Kensington, 34, owner of a century-old bakery in Denver's Colfax Heritage District. And the morning my name nearly vanished from its brick facade began with a trembling FaceTime call from my night manager, Sarah, whose breath kept catching as she lifted the phone toward the shattered remains of my vintage hearth, while my sister Ruby leaned into the frame with a bright, cutting smile and asked if I was finally ready to stop pretending this place is yours. Ruby shifted just enough for me to see the sledgehammer resting against the fractured stone as my parents hovered behind her. And the moment Linda declared that my bakery was merely a placeholder until Ruby needed it for her floral studio, Gerald folded his arms and told me to sign the transfer because family comes first and you've had your turn. I watched Ruby kick through the debris where my recipe ledger had fallen under brick dust. And when she lifted her chin and told me to be a good sister or she'd make sure Denver believed I'd abandoned the family business, I steadied my voice long enough to tell Sarah her job was safe under my holding company payroll before taking a single screenshot and ending the call. The quiet that followed felt too sharp for a room that should have held ordinary hotel air. Yet all I could think about was the way Ruby's confidence flared when she said I'd never fight her for the building. As if my years of dawn labor could be swept into the same pile she had just kicked aside. My pulse thudded in my ears. Not because of the threat, but because of her certainty that I would come running home to defend what she'd already decided belonged to her. She stood there, claiming victory before any battle had even begun, unaware that the only thing holding me still in that hotel chair was the fact that she believed her own performance so completely she couldn't imagine a world in which I wouldn't play the role she'd written for me. I knew then why I hadn't yelled or begged or booked the next flight back to Denver. Because the evidence was still glowing on my screen, Ruby framed in pride beside a collapsed oven, my parents treating the trespass as a family correction, and Sarah trying not to cry as the lie about my authorization unraveled behind her. Nothing about that moment asked for noise. It asked for precision, and as I stared at the screenshot, the truth settled with a weight I could measure as clearly as flour on a scale. That they didn't come for my bakery in a moment of desperation, but in a moment of entitlement so complete they thought, breaking it open would reveal something they already owned. I stayed in that hotel chair long after the screen went black, because the wreckage behind Ruby wasn't just broken stone, but every hour I'd spent shaping dough before sunrise. And the proof sat right there, in the burns along my forearms that never fully faded, no matter how many ointments I tried. The district had approved my heritage permits only after I memorized every clause on load-bearing preservation. And hearing Ruby call the bakery a tired old box I'm upgrading told me she had no idea that the wall behind her wasn't decoration, but the spine of the building. My parents, hovering in agreement, completed the picture, and the weight of their certainty pressed harder than their words. I thought about Gerald's refrain that, "You always bounce back. Mara, you're the practical one." A line he'd thrown at me each time Ruby abandoned another art venture after sinking thousands she didn't earn. And I could still hear Linda insisting that it was my responsibility to help, because your sister just needs space to shine. Opening my bakery had taken years of double shifts and a stack of municipal guides I used as bedtime reading, while Ruby jumped from beadwork to painted denim to floral installations without ever finishing a season. Yet the moment she wanted my space, they all acted as though it had been waiting for her. Watching them through Sarah's shaking camera wasn't shocking. It was confirmation of a pattern they'd never bothered to hide. What stopped me from running to the airport wasn't shock or restraint, but the way Ruby looked into that lens, as if the building already belonged to her. Because that expression told me she believed the story my parents built around her more than any truth she'd touched. If I flew home, I would step straight into that story and become the villain who blocked her dream. And the evidence was still fresh on my phone. Ruby swinging a hammer over a hearth she didn't understand. Linda praising her initiative. Gerald nodding as if trespass were a family tradition. They weren't waiting for a fight. They were waiting for me to fall back into the role that made their lives easier. And the quiet inside that hotel room told me I wasn't carrying that role anymore. The quiet in that hotel room held its shape long enough for me to realize nothing I did in Denver would matter unless I stopped letting them believe I'd rush home to clean the mess. and the evidence was still fresh in my mind. Ruby swinging a hammer she didn't understand while my parents praised her for finally taking charge. I opened my laptop and pulled up a contract template I used for equipment rentals. And the idea settled cleanly once I remembered the way Gerald nodded in that call, as though the building were his to reassign. So I reworked the document into a transfer of management and renovation rights and placed a single line near the top that read, "Upon execution. Operating cash of $15,000 will be released to the project manager." Nothing about the bait felt excessive, because the image of Ruby's face in that live stream told me she would chase the number before she wondered why the terms looked generous. I buried the real weight deeper in the agreement. Drafting Clause 4.2 to state that all structural alterations and heritage compliance responsibilities shifted entirely to the project manager. And the language came easily after years of reading municipal code to keep my bakery alive under historic restrictions. Clause 6.1 followed with the same precision, naming Gerald and Linda as personal guarantors for any damages or penalties assessed by the property owner. And the lines felt almost too simple after watching them stand behind Ruby as she broke into my space without hesitation. I attached the document to an email and wrote, "If this is what you all want, I won't fight you. Sign so I can release the funds and clear my name from the utilities." And I sent it without adjusting a single word. The signatures arrived within minutes. 3 notifications landing in quick succession. And the timing told me everything I needed to know about how little scrutiny they had given to a building they claimed to value more than the person who built it. Their names appeared beside digital timestamps as clearly as the cracks I'd seen spreading across the stonework in Sarah's call. And the certainty that had kept Ruby smiling into the camera now worked in my favor with a finality I didn't need to narrate aloud. I closed the laptop with the steady understanding that I hadn't trapped them. They had walked into the terms willingly, and all I'd done was stop shielding them from the consequences they believed only existed for other people. Ruby's transformation of my bakery unfolded in real time on my screen that afternoon. Her voice lifted with triumph as she announced to a stream of strangers that she was liberating dead space and making room for beauty. And the camera followed her hand as she traced the outline of the wall she planned to erase before stepping aside so a contractor could swing a hammer straight into the load-bearing brick. The impact sent a pale cloud drifting across the frame while Linda typed hearts in the comments, and Gerald declared that the district would thank Ruby for her vision. And nothing about their celebration dimmed, even when the lens caught a crack threading upward through the ceiling beam like a thin gray vein. I watched the dust fall in a steady breath and recognized the shift in the timber's posture, the same way I would have recognized a dough collapsing before proof. Not because I was guessing, but because the heritage permit I earned had required me to study the building's anatomy the way other people studied family lore. The stream kept jumping angles as Ruby narrated her plan to open the whole spine of the place. A phrase that might have sounded poetic to anyone who didn't know. The spine she referenced was the very reason the building still stood. And when she laughed that Denver finally had a florist willing to break rules, I understood she had no idea the rules she boasted about breaking weren't decorative. That crack in the ceiling widened by the minute, just enough for the dust to drift in a way I recognized from old inspections. And the rhythm of the thudding swings matched the subtle shift in the floor joists that I remembered from the last time the district measured load distribution. Her voice rose when she told her viewers that the bakery had been suffocating under tradition, and the camera tilted again to show shards of historic tile scattered across the floor like confetti. I picked up my phone not to intervene but to repeat the line the permit office had taught me for emergencies, telling the building safety hotline that there was unauthorized demolition occurring at a Class 1 heritage site and directing them to the live stream where the wall was already halfway gone. And the operator's tone changed the moment she heard the words "occupied upper floors." The evidence sat right there in Ruby's own broadcast, her laughter echoing under a ceiling that no longer carried its weight cleanly, and the ease with which the dispatcher confirmed the address told me the footage alone had met the threshold for a code-red response. I ended the call as Ruby declared that she was reclaiming the structure from the past, unaware that the past she mocked had stronger laws than the approval she chased. And the crack above her kept lengthening in a way no filter could soften. I arrived early to watch from my car as guests drifted toward the storefront. Ruby had renamed in looping script, and the live stream on my phone caught her lifting a glass while announcing that Denver finally has a space willing to break away from stale tradition. A line she delivered beneath the same ceiling, where a thin ribbon of plaster kept drifting down like breath. Linda hovered beside her, boasting that I had been too burnt out to manage anything this ambitious. And Gerald clapped Ruby's shoulder while telling a cluster of neighbors that my bakery had needed a real visionary for years. Words he shaped with the same ease he once used to call my workhorse nature the backbone of our family. The camera panned across the arch where the load-bearing wall used to stand, and the crack spreading above it had grown wide enough for dust to fall in steady pulses that no one inside seemed to notice. The crowd cheered when Ruby stretched a white ribbon across the entrance and announced that she was opening the era of Ruby Bloom Atelier. And the timing struck me because the floor under her feet dipped in a way I recognized from the old inspection logs. I watched her lift the scissors and tell her followers that this was what it looks like when you stop waiting for permission. And the beam above her responded with a muted groan that even the phone mic didn't soften. Gerald urged her to cut before the light changed, and Linda whispered that the district would finally see what beauty looks like when fear steps aside, both unaware that the live stream had caught another layer of plaster loosening right over their heads. The first city truck pulled up so abruptly that the guests outside stepped back in confusion. And before Ruby could shape another triumphant line, a voice cut through the music demanding that everyone stop moving because this structure is showing active signs of failure. The live stream jolted as people turned, and Chief Holt walked straight toward the arch, scanning the span with a laser measure, while Ruby announced that this had to be a misunderstanding and that my sister owns the lease. So talk to her. Holt raised his hand toward the widening fracture and responded that unauthorized demolition in a Class 1 heritage building was a criminal offense, and the shift in the room deepened when he added that the risk to people upstairs made it a code red condition. Guests pressed back from the flowers as Ruby insisted that she wasn't responsible and that Mara let the place rot for years. Yet the evidence of her renovation streamed from her own account in videos that Holt's assistant had already queued for documentation. Victor stepped into the doorway with the same calm he carried through every contract negotiation I'd ever watched him navigate, and his voice reached the mic on Ruby's phone as he addressed Holt and explained that management and renovation rights had been transferred fully to Ruby Kensington under a signed agreement executed 2 weeks earlier. He lifted his tablet to show her signature beside the acknowledgement of receiving $15,000 in operating cash and summarized Clause 4, 2, clarifying that complete responsibility for all structural alterations belonged to the project manager identified in the contract. Ruby's face changed when he played the clip of her swinging the first hammer while bragging about opening the building's spine, and the quiet that followed felt heavier than the plaster still drifting from the beam. Holt affixed the red notice across the entrance and announced that the building was unsafe for occupancy and subject to criminal investigation. And the sound of that sticker pressing against the glass reached me through both the live stream and the street. Ruby backed toward the toppled vases, insisting that this couldn't be happening and that Mara set me up. But the contract timestamp glowed beneath her signature like its own rebuttal, and the structure above her creaked again, as if marking the moment she realized the celebration she'd crafted around herself had already begun collapsing. The red notice was still hanging on the door when the landlord's representative arrived the next morning, and the call I received from his office carried the clipped precision of someone reading directly from a lease that had just been violated in every way possible, as he informed me that accelerated rent in the amount of $180,000 is now due from the current management and their guarantors. The phrasing landed cleanly because the contract I drafted had already shifted every responsibility onto Ruby, and the representative followed the line with a reminder that criminal negligence in a heritage building did not pause rent obligations. I listened without interruption, knowing the paperwork sitting in Victor's hands matched every word. By noon, Ruby had tried filing an insurance claim using the footage from her own account, and the denial came back almost instantly with the statement that coverage is void when damage results from intentional illegal acts by an authorized agent. A sentence that mirrored the moment she told her followers she was breaking rules for beauty while plaster drifted behind her. Gerald called shortly after, insisting there must be a misunderstanding, and you need to step in before the district ruins your sister's life. And Linda cut in, begging me to fix this like you always do. Each voice tangled in the same disbelief that the liability they had signed wasn't imaginary. The silence that followed my refusal stretched long enough for Gerald to finally ask who was responsible for the payments. And the pause in his breathing told me he recognized the terms before I repeated that clause. 6.1 carried both their names. Within 3 weeks, the figures from the investigation settled into final amounts that Ruby couldn't begin to cover, and the notice of personal bankruptcy landed on public record, just as the district posted the full assessment of structural damage. Gerald and Linda received the foreclosure date on their home, shortly after the landlord initiated collection on the accelerated rent. And the last voicemail Gerald left carried a brittle edge, as he insisted that family shouldn't use paperwork as a weapon. A line that clashed sharply with the digital signatures they had added without hesitation. I didn't return the call. Not because the words cut, but because the truth of their situation was already written into every consequence. They triggered the moment they trusted entitlement more than the load-bearing rules of a building they never bothered to understand. The payout from my business interruption policy arrived with the same stark wording the investigation had used, confirming that damages caused by a third party activated full coverage. And the certainty of that line echoed through the new industrial unit I leased on the outskirts of Denver, where the floors were level, the ceilings uncompromised, and no one insisted that tradition was something to be destroyed for spectacle. Sarah stood beside the new deck oven when I walked in for the first test batch, and her quiet productions already up 20%, with this layout settled into the room with a steadiness that felt earned rather than inherited. I pressed my palms into a mound of dough warming under my hands and let the structure of it anchor me in a space no one had touched but me. I sent a single message to the family group chat that afternoon, attaching the insurance denial that carried Ruby's name as the responsible agent and writing only, "You wanted the space. You own the consequences." A line that matched every signature they had placed beneath the contract they never bothered to read. The message delivered without hesitation, and the thread stayed silent long enough for me to understand. They finally recognized the difference between the safety net they had relied on and the distance I'd chosen. I blocked the thread without waiting for the familiar cascade of explanations that had once followed every crisis Ruby created. Because the collapse of that building had already told the whole story more clearly than any apology ever could. The bakery's opening week in the new unit felt like stepping into a version of my work that no longer carried the weight of being a family's emergency plan. And the orders came in faster than I expected once the neighborhood realized I was rebuilding. Sarah handed me a tray of croissants with a brief, "Customers are asking if you'll add a Saturday market box." And the question landed with a kind of quiet possibility I hadn't allowed myself to imagine while watching my old walls fall. I stayed in the kitchen after closing, shaping the last batch of dough and letting the rhythm of it settle into the empty space. Because the truth was simple and unmistakable beneath my hands. The future I had been working toward finally belonged to me. And for the first time in years, nothing and no one else was standing in that room. When I locked up the new unit that night, the quiet felt steady enough for me to whisper, "Thank you for staying with me through this." I added that hearing where people are watching from always reminds me I'm not rebuilding alone. And I asked anyone who wants more stories to subscribe, so we can keep going together.